The air hummed with quiet conversations, the soft rustle of newspapers, and the distant clatter of drink trays. Passengers in first class settled into their leather seats, some scrolling through their tablets, others adjusting their noise-canceling headphones. Everything was just as it should be, until it wasn't. Karen Lawrence, the lead flight attendant, moved through the aisle with a sense of practiced authority. She had spent over a decade in the skies and had seen it all. Celebrities, high-profile executives, and the occasional passenger who thought they were above the rules. Her sharp gaze swept across the cabin, assessing, ensuring everything was as it should be. Then her eyes landed on them. An older black couple sat comfortably in the center of first class. The man, dressed in a well-fitted gray suit, flipped through a folded newspaper with the kind of ease that suggested he had done this 1,000 times before. His wife, draped in an elegant navy shawl, adjusted the strap of her designer handbag and reached for a glass of sparkling water. Karen felt something tighten in her chest. She had a gut feeling, one honed from years of instinct, that something was off. She stepped forward. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice carrying that polite firmness perfected by flight attendants worldwide. "I need to see your tickets." The man looked up, mildly surprised, but without hesitation. He reached into his jacket pocket and handed them over. His wife watched Karen with an expression that was unreadable, calm, poised, but somehow piercing. Karen barely glanced at the boarding passes before handing them back. "First class is reserved for paying customers," she said, keeping her voice light but firm. The woman who had been silent until now finally spoke. "We paid for these seats." Her voice was steady, controlled. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm just following procedure. I'll need to verify your tickets at the front desk." A few heads turned. The businessman in seat 2A, a middle-aged man with a Bluetooth headset still clinging to his ear, subtly lowered his phone. A young mother across the aisle shifted in her seat, instinctively pulling her toddler closer. People were pretending not to watch, but they were listening. The man folded his newspaper carefully, setting it down beside him. He wasn't angry, he wasn't flustered. If anything, he looked exhausted. His wife exhaled slowly, smoothing out an invisible wrinkle on her skirt. "What exactly needs to be verified?" she asked. Karen forced a smile. "I just need to check something with the front desk. Please gather your things." Neither of them moved. A flicker of irritation flashed through Karen. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, those who refused to switch off their phones, those who insisted on standing when the seatbelt sign was on. But this was different. There was a defiance here, not in their words, but in their stillness. Passengers exchanged glances, some looking away quickly, pretending to be absorbed in their in-flight entertainment screens. No one wanted to get involved, but the air had shifted. The unspoken tension had settled over first class like an incoming storm. Finally, the man leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. "I suggest you check the manifest before you take this any further." His voice was even, measured. Karen felt a surge of something. Was it embarrassment? Frustration? She straightened her posture. "Sir, I'm going to have to insist." The woman folded her arms. "And I'm going to have to refuse." For the first time, Karen hesitated. The businessman in 2A tapped his fingers against his armrest. The young mother bit her lip. And somewhere, someone exhaled like they knew exactly where this was headed. Without another word, Karen turned sharply and strode toward the front of the plane. She pressed the intercom button near the galley. "Security to first class," she said. "I have a seating issue." It took less than a minute for the response. A uniformed security officer, tall and built like someone who didn't need to repeat himself, stepped into the cabin. His name tag read, "Mark Grayson." Passengers tensed as he made his way toward the couple. Karen folded her arms, a small sense of satisfaction blooming in her chest. This would be handled. Mark stopped beside them, clearing his throat. "Sir, ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me to clear up a seating issue." The man adjusted his reading glasses, calm as ever. "A seating issue," he repeated. "Our tickets are right here." Mark hesitated, glancing briefly at Karen, then back at the couple. His posture shifted slightly, less authoritative, more cautious. "This is just protocol," he said, but his voice didn't carry the same confidence anymore. The woman's expression didn't change. "We are elderly," she said, her voice slow, deliberate. "You're asking us to stand up, gather our belongings, and walk all the way to the front of the plane because this woman," she flicked her eyes toward Karen, "refuses to believe we belong here." Mark's jaw tightened. He had handled disruptive passengers before. He had escorted drunk businessmen, belligerent tourists, and people who lost their tempers mid-flight. But this wasn't that. This couple wasn't causing trouble. They weren't yelling. They weren't refusing to comply. They were simply sitting. And yet the flight attendant was standing there, arms crossed, as if she had already made up her mind. Karen sighed dramatically. If there's no mistake, they can come back after verification. The man exhaled, shaking his head. If there's no mistake, we shouldn't have to move in the first place. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Mark inhaled slowly, looking at Karen again. Did you check the manifest? Karen stiffened. I don't need to, she said. I know it's a mistake. Mark was silent for a long moment. Then, to Karen's horror, he reached for his radio. Control, this is Officer Grayson, requesting verification on 2 first-class passengers before removal. Karen's confidence wavered. There was a brief crackle of static. Then the reply came through, clear and firm. Do not remove those passengers. Repeat, do not remove those passengers under any circumstances. We're sending someone to handle this. Mark's head snapped up. Karen's arms dropped to her sides. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. The businessman in 2A subtly angled his phone, pressing record. The young mother held her toddler closer. Karen felt her stomach twist as reality began to settle in. Something was very, very wrong, and she had no idea what was about to happen next. Karen felt her breath hitch as the silence in the cabin stretched on. She had expected quick compliance, maybe a bit of resistance, but nothing like this. She glanced at Mark, but his focus was elsewhere now, his posture shifting from firm authority to cautious hesitation. Passengers weren't pretending not to listen anymore. They were invested. The businessman in 2A had his phone angled just right, his screen reflecting the overhead cabin lights. The young mother across the aisle held her child a little tighter, her gaze flicking between Karen and the couple. The older man, what was his name, sat perfectly still, one hand resting on the armrest, his fingers barely tapping against the leather. His wife hadn't moved either, but there was something about the way she looked at Karen, something unsettlingly patient. A shuffle near the front of the cabin drew attention. The curtain separating first class from the galley was pulled back, and a man in a dark navy suit stepped in, Nathan Calloway. Karen felt a wave of unease roll through her. Nathan was regional management, the kind of person who never intervened unless something had gone seriously wrong. He wasn't supposed to be on this flight. Yet here he was, his face unreadable as he made his way down the aisle with quiet authority. Passengers straightened in their seats, sensing a shift in power. Nathan's eyes scanned the cabin before landing on the couple. His jaw tightened slightly, but his expression remained composed. He stopped beside Mark, glancing at him before turning his attention to Karen. Miss Lawrence, he said evenly, what seems to be the issue? Karen swallowed. These passengers. She gestured toward the couple, suddenly acutely aware of how many people were watching. Are in first class, but their tickets need verification. Nathan's gaze didn't waver. Did you check the manifest? Karen hesitated. Did you check the manifest? Nathan repeated, his tone leaving no room for interpretation. Karen's mouth felt dry. She had been so sure, so sure. Nathan exhaled sharply, his disappointment almost tangible. Then in a voice quieter than before, but somehow more powerful, he said, Miss Lawrence, these 2 passengers don't just belong in first class. He turned to the couple, his posture shifting into something more respectful. Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding. Karen's stomach dropped. The name hit her like a freight train. Bennett, as in Bennett Airlines. The couple owned the airline. Passengers around them inhaled sharply. Someone whispered, no way. The businessman in 2A muttered something under his breath, likely realizing the footage on his phone had just become a lot more valuable. The young mother's eyes widened as she clutched her child closer. Karen's throat tightened. You didn't verify, Nathan finished for her. A slow, sinking dread settled over her. Mrs. Bennett adjusted her shawl, her movements precise. Tell me, Miss Lawrence, she said, her voice as smooth as ever. How many other passengers did you ask for proof today? Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. Nathan's expression remained cold. Miss Lawrence, you are relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. The weight of his words hit like a hammer. Karen felt the blood drain from her face as Mark shifted slightly, as if preparing to escort her away. Passengers were still watching, their eyes sharp with curiosity, judgment, and something close to satisfaction. Karen had been so sure she was right, so sure she was the one in control. Now she had none left. Karen's body felt numb as she stood there, frozen in place. Just moments ago, she had been the one calling the shots. Now she was the one being dismissed. The weight of every stair in the cabin pressed against her, making it impossible to breathe. Nathan Calloway didn't look away. His voice was calm, measured, but his authority cut through the silence like a blade. "Mark, escort Miss Lawrence to the galley." Mark hesitated for just a second before nodding. "Miss Lawrence, this way." Karen's feet refused to move at first. She had spent years enforcing the rules, making sure passengers followed protocol. Now she was the one being told what to do. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, a justification, anything that could make the situation disappear. "I was just doing my job," she finally managed, her voice quieter than she intended. Nathan's eyes remained cold. "Your job," he said, "was to ensure a smooth flight, not escalate a situation based on an assumption." Karen's jaw clenched. The whispering around her grew louder, and she could feel the judgment settling in like a storm cloud over her head. The businessman in 2A was still recording. The young mother in 3C shook her head slightly, whispering something to herself. Mrs. Bennett let out a quiet hum, studying Karen like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "You were so sure," she mused. "So convinced that we didn't belong here." Karen's face burned. Mr. Bennett folded his hands together, his expression unreadable. "Tell me, Miss Lawrence," he said, his voice smooth but pointed, "if we weren't the owners of this airline, would you even be questioning your actions right now?" Karen wanted to say yes. She needed to say yes, but the truth lodged itself in her throat like a stone. Nathan inhaled sharply, glancing at Mark. "Now." Mark stepped closer. "Miss Lawrence." With no other choice, Karen turned on her heel and walked toward the galley. Each step felt heavier than the last. The aisle had never seemed so long before. Passengers avoided her gaze as she passed, some pretending to be absorbed in their screens, others not bothering to hide their curiosity. The businessman in 2A had a small smirk on his lips, like he had just won a bet. Reaching the galley, Karen gripped the counter to steady herself. The sounds of the aircraft faded into the background. Her career, everything she had built, was slipping through her fingers. David Langley, the senior flight attendant, stood near the galley entrance. He had been silent the entire time, watching everything unfold. Now he stepped forward, lowering his voice. "You really messed up, Karen." She spun toward him, anger flickering to the surface. "I was following protocol." David's expression didn't change. "No, you were making a decision based on who you thought they were." He shook his head, his voice quieter now. "And you were wrong." Karen's hands curled into fists at her sides. For the first time, she had no argument left. The galley felt smaller than it ever had before. Karen leaned against the counter, her hands gripping the cold metal surface, her breath shallow. The distant hum of the engines was drowned out by the ringing in her ears. She had spent years walking through these aisles with confidence, commanding respect. Now she felt like a stranger in her own uniform. David stood a few feet away, arms crossed. His expression wasn't angry, just disappointed. That was somehow worse. "You need to prepare yourself," he said finally. Karen swallowed hard. "For what?" David sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "I just got off the phone with ground operations." He hesitated. "The executive board already knows what happened." Karen's stomach dropped. "They know?" Her voice came out weaker than she intended. David nodded. "Bennett called them mid-flight." The words sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't just an incident anymore. This was a disaster. She forced herself to stand straighter. "I'll explain myself when we land." David gave her a long look. "You really don't get it, do you?" Karen's fingers twitched at her sides. "I was enforcing rules." "No," David said, shaking his head. "You were enforcing your version of the rules, and now you're paying for it." Before Karen could respond, the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've begun our descent. Flight attendants, prepare for landing." David sighed. "You should think about what you're going to say when you step off this plane." Karen didn't answer. She already knew there was nothing she could say to fix this. The plane touched down with a smooth jolt, the familiar feeling of landing doing nothing to steady Karen's nerves. The seatbelt signs dinged off, and passengers immediately began gathering their belongings, the usual shuffling and quiet conversations filling the cabin. But in first class, the energy was different. Tense, waiting. Karen remained in the galley, gripping the counter, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. She had never dreaded an arrival before. Usually, touchdown meant another successful flight in the books, another shift done. But this time, she had no idea what was waiting for her once she stepped off the aircraft. The cabin door hissed as it unlocked, and the jet bridge connected. Then, a new voice filled the cabin, not from the intercom, but from the front of the plane. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated for a few moments while we address a situation before disembarkation. Passengers exchanged glances. The businessman in 2A immediately pulled out his phone, clearly anticipating something worth recording. The young mother, still holding her child, frowned but said nothing. Karen felt her stomach twist as footsteps echoed from the entrance of the plane, slow, deliberate. Then she saw him, Otis Bennett. He didn't speak right away, just stood at the front of the first-class cabin, looking at everything, at everyone, as if he already knew exactly how this was going to play out. His wife, Evelyn, stood beside him, her hands folded neatly over her shawl. Nathan Calloway was a step behind them, his expression unreadable. Karen's mouth went dry. Nathan glanced in her direction, then back at the Bennetts. "Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Bennett," he said smoothly. "If you have anything to say before we proceed, you have the floor." Karen's body went cold. Evelyn turned, her gaze landing on Karen. "I'd like to hear it from her first." Karen's pulse pounded. "Hear what?" Otis let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "You know exactly what." The first-class cabin was silent. Every passenger was watching now. Karen forced herself to swallow. She felt trapped, exposed, and for the first time, she wasn't sure what to say. She had spent so many years being the one in control, the one making decisions. But now, standing there under their unflinching stares, she realized she had no control at all, and she had no one to blame but herself. Karen's throat felt tight as every pair of eyes in the first-class cabin locked onto her. The weight of the silence was unbearable. She had spent years commanding respect in this uniform, but right now she felt like she was standing in front of a jury waiting for a verdict. She swallowed hard and forced herself to meet Evelyn Bennett's gaze. I'm sorry." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "For what?" Karen's breath hitched. She had hoped those two words would be enough, but it was clear they weren't. She was being made to say it, to acknowledge it, and there was no way around it. Her pulse pounded in her ears. "I assumed you didn't belong in first class," she admitted, the words bitter in her mouth. "I didn't check the manifest. I didn't verify anything. I assumed." A murmur rippled through the cabin. The businessman in 2A leaned forward slightly, his phone still recording. The young mother in 3C shifted uncomfortably, as if suddenly aware of how much this moment meant. Otis exhaled slowly, tilting his head. "And why do you think you assumed that?" Karen felt something cold settle in her chest. Nathan Calloway, who had been standing silently until now, finally spoke. "Miss Lawrence, if you can't answer that question, I think we already know the answer." Karen's face burned. Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. "Well?" Karen clenched her fists at her sides. She wanted to argue, to justify herself, to come up with any excuse that would lessen the weight of this moment. But she couldn't, because there was only one truth, and she knew it as well as they did. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Because when I looked at you," she said, "I didn't expect to see you in first class." A sharp inhale came from somewhere in the cabin. Otis nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had known all along. "Now that," he said, "is the first honest thing you've said all day." Karen's hands trembled. Evelyn tapped a manicured nail against the armrest, her expression unreadable. "An apology doesn't undo what happened," she said. "It doesn't erase the fact that you humiliated us in front of an entire cabin full of passengers. It doesn't change the fact that you called security before even bothering to check the facts." Karen felt the air leave her lungs. Otis turned to Nathan. "I think we've heard enough." Nathan gave a curt nod. "Miss Lawrence, you are officially relieved of duty, effective immediately. You will be escorted off the plane and placed on indefinite suspension pending further review." Karen's stomach lurched. "Wait," she stammered, panic rising in her throat. I was just following protocol." Otis let out a short, humorless laugh. "No, Miss Lawrence," he said simply. "It wasn't protocol. It was a choice." And just like that, it was over. Karen stood there, frozen, as Mark, the security officer, stepped forward. "Miss Lawrence," he said, his voice neutral but firm. "Let's go." Her body felt disconnected from her mind as she turned, walking toward the exit. The aisle had never felt longer. The whispers behind her grew louder. She had spent years believing she was in control. But today she had learned the truth. She had never had control at all. Karen stepped off the plane, her legs unsteady as she entered the jet bridge. The cold air hit her like a slap, but it did nothing to clear the numbness spreading through her chest. Her hands curled into fists at her sides as Mark followed closely behind, his presence a silent reminder that she was no longer in charge. The doors behind her shut with a quiet finality, sealing her fate inside that aircraft. She barely registered the sound of footsteps as they walked through the terminal. Travelers bustled past, oblivious to the fact that her career had just collapsed in a single flight. Screens flashed with departure times, employees moved efficiently from gate to gate, and the world continued as if nothing had changed. But for her, everything had. At the crew exit, a uniformed airport official stood waiting, a man in his late 40s, with sharp eyes and a company-issued envelope in his hands. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. "Miss Lawrence," he said, holding out the envelope. "This is for you." Karen took it without looking at him, her fingers trembling as she ripped open the seal. The letter inside was exactly what she expected. Effective immediately, you are placed on indefinite suspension pending a formal review. Her breath hitched. No flights, no crew access, no paycheck. The man's voice was professional but distant. "You'll need to clear out your employee locker by the end of the day." Karen's grip tightened on the paper. "They've already decided, haven't they?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She turned away sharply, forcing herself to keep walking. She had spent years moving through this airport with confidence, walking these halls with authority. Now, she wasn't even sure where she was going. By the time she reached the crew lounge, her heart was pounding so loudly she could barely think. She pushed the door open, and for the first time in her career, the room fell silent at her arrival. They all knew. Some avoided her gaze, pretending to be absorbed in their tablets or coffee cups. Others stole quick glances before whispering to one another. The judgment, the pity, the quiet relief that it wasn't them in her position. It was all there. Karen swallowed hard and moved toward her locker, forcing her hands to stay steady as she turned the combination lock. As she pulled her belongings out, a voice broke the silence. "Karen," she turned. Lisa Graham, a senior flight attendant with over 20 years in the industry, stood near the doorway, arms crossed. Lisa had always been fair but firm, the kind of person people listened to. Karen had once respected her. Now, she felt exposed under her sharp gaze. Lisa took a step forward, lowering her voice so only Karen could hear. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to really think before you answer." Karen's jaw tightened. "What?" Lisa tilted her head slightly. "If they weren't the owners of the airline, would you have felt bad at all?" Karen flinched, but she masked it quickly. "That's ridiculous." Lisa didn't blink. "Is it?" Karen looked away. "I was following protocol." Lisa sighed, shaking her head. "No, you weren't. You made a decision based on who you thought they were, and you were wrong." Karen shoved the last of her things into her bag, her breath uneven. "So what? You think I deserve this?" Lisa shrugged. "It doesn't matter what I think. What matters is what you do next." Karen frowned. "Next?" Lisa's voice was calm but firm. "You can walk out of here blaming everyone but yourself, or you can actually learn something from this." Karen scoffed. "And what exactly am I supposed to learn?" Lisa studied her for a long moment, then said, "That power isn't about control, it's about responsibility, and you abused it." The words hit harder than Karen expected. Lisa didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked away, leaving Karen standing there alone. For the first time, Karen had nothing to say. Karen sat alone in her small apartment, the dim glow of her laptop screen illuminating the crumpled letter of suspension on the table. The weight of everything pressed down on her chest, her career, her reputation, the silence of a future she no longer controlled. She had spent the last few hours replaying every second of that flight. The way she stood over Otis and Evelyn Bennett, the way she dismissed their calm explanations, the way she had been so sure of herself until she wasn't. Her phone buzzed. She hesitated before picking it up. The screen flashed a notification from the airline's HR department. A formal meeting, 10 a.m. tomorrow. Karen exhaled shakily, setting the phone down. This was it, her last chance to explain, to justify, to fight for what was left of her career. But for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to fight at all, because deep down, she finally saw what she had refused to see before. This wasn't something that had happened to her. This was something she had done to herself. The next morning, she arrived at the corporate offices, her steps slower than they had ever been. The glass doors gleamed under the morning sun, and for the first time in years, she hesitated before walking inside. The receptionist barely glanced at her, typing into a computer before motioning toward the elevators. "Third floor, conference room 2. Karen stepped inside the elevator, her pulse steady but heavy. The ride was silent, too silent. When the doors slid open, Nathan Calloway was already waiting. His expression gave nothing away. "Follow me," he said simply. She did. Inside the conference room, Otis and Evelyn Bennett sat at the long glass table, their posture composed, their presence commanding. 2 other board members sat beside them, watching with neutral expressions. A single chair sat empty at the other end of the table, waiting for her. Karen took her seat, forcing herself to meet Otis's gaze. Nathan sat down last, folding his hands in front of him. "Miss Lawrence," he said, his voice professional but firm, "we're giving you an opportunity to explain yourself before we make our final decision." Karen swallowed hard. She had spent the entire night crafting a speech in her head, a defense of her actions, an argument that she had only been following policy. But now, sitting in front of them, she knew there was only one answer that mattered: the truth. She took a slow breath. "I assumed you didn't belong in first class." No one reacted. They were waiting. Karen forced herself to continue. "I didn't check the manifest. I didn't verify anything. I made a decision based on what I saw, and I was wrong." Otis tilted his head slightly. "Go on." Karen exhaled. "I called security because I was convinced I was right. I escalated the situation instead of fixing it. I was so sure of my own authority that I didn't stop to consider that I might be the problem." She hesitated before adding, "And if you weren't the owners of the airline, I don't think I ever would have realized how wrong I was." A long silence filled the room. Nathan exchanged a look with the board members, then turned back to Otis and Evelyn. "Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Bennett, you asked to be here for this. What's your recommendation?" Otis leaned forward, his fingers intertwined. "Let me ask you something, Miss Lawrence." Karen braced herself. "If you were given another chance, would you actually change?" She swallowed hard. "Yes." Otis raised an eyebrow. "How can we believe that?" Her voice was steady now. "Because I'm not the same person who stepped onto that plane 2 days ago." Otis studied her carefully. Evelyn tapped a manicured nail against the table, thoughtful. Finally, Evelyn spoke. "Suspension, 6 months, mandatory bias training, and if we hear about anything like this again," she met Karen's eyes, "there will be no second review." Karen's breath hitched. 6 months, not career ending, but a choice. Otis nodded. "That's our recommendation." Nathan looked at the board. "Understood." Then he turned back to Karen. "Miss Lawrence, you'll receive an official letter from HR confirming your suspension. You won't be allowed on any flights in any capacity for the next 6 months. After that, you'll be reevaluated." Karen blinked rapidly, trying to process everything. "I thank you." Otis gave her a long, knowing look. "Don't thank us." He stood, adjusting his jacket. "Show us that you deserve it." Evelyn rose beside him, smoothing her dress. "And if I were you, Miss Lawrence," she said, a faint smile playing at her lips, "I'd take this time to figure out who you really are." Karen sat frozen as the 2 of them left the room, their presence lingering even after they were gone. Nathan stood next, motioning toward the door. "Meeting's over. You know what to do." Karen slowly rose, gripping the edge of the table for support. She had walked into this room expecting the worst. Instead, she had walked away with something she never thought she would get: a second chance. As she stepped into the hallway, she took a deep breath. She had lost her power, her control, the certainty she once carried. But maybe, just maybe, she had gained something even more valuable. And that realization hit her harder than anything else. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't the one giving lessons. She was the one learning.
This content is a work of fiction and art designed for entertainment and educational purposes. Any similarities to real individuals or events are purely coincidental. Certain scenes and dialogues in the video are dramatized and contain elements of grotesque, satire, and exaggeration. The creator firmly opposes discrimination, violence, and hatred. This channel adheres to YouTube's guidelines and respects copyright laws.